Cozy Complex Devlog 1. I thought I'd talk about inspiration. Cozy Complex is my attempt at making a game for myself. Recently, I accepted redundancy from the university I worked at, and that meant that I could kind of throw myself into creating my own game. And I wanted to do a solo development, so I don't have all of the sort of burden of working with or trying to create a group of people to work on a game without being paid. So the main inspiration for the actual game itself, weirdly enough, came from an art pack. So when you're making games with Unreal Engine, there's quite often a lot of like artwork available, and these days there's sites like fab.com that make it even easier. And the reality is that this art pack showed a sort of bunker environment, and I thought that was a really interesting place to set a cozy game. And by cozy, I'm kind of not talking about typical cozy games have a very specific aesthetic, and I didn't really want that. I wanted to do something that was like a typical, I don't want to use the word realistic, but like a typical game world. And so the inspiration became the idea that this world was set underground in a bunker, and I was going to call it Cozy Bunker, but the URL for that isn't available. But then I started thinking about sort of the main sort of themes for this, things like crafting and trading and those kind of things are the kind of games that I like, and automation, more sort of base building kind of mechanics. So games like Dyson Sphere Program and Satisfactory, I've played huge amounts of time into those. So I wanted to make a game something along those lines, but where it's mostly programmer work and not like tons and tons of artwork. And then I hit up on the idea of using like essentially fab assets, but unifying it under a sort of essentially a post-apocalyptic viewpoint. And I kind of always loved the post-apocalyptic stuff anyway, or the sort of dystopian future kind of view anyway. So some of the inspirations for this are things like there's a film called Silent Running from the 70s, which has this guy essentially working in sort of an eco-biodome thing with a couple of robots. And it is quite sort of dark and depressing. But this idea of like living in isolation with technology and trying to maintain a specific sort of ecosystem, I thought was a really interesting dynamic. Aesthetically, I've been going for more of a sort of, I guess, a rusty sort of feel, but also high tech as well. So really big inspirations from things like, in a way, I wanted to go for the warmth of something like the film and series Serenity. I wanted that sort of small community thing. But I also like the sort of brutalism of things like that Star Wars spin-off. I can't remember the name of it, but you know, the one with the sort of rebellion thing, Andor. So if you look at Andor, the sort of brutalism of that, but it's still believable. And that's the thing that I think is fundamental for me, is that it needs to be truly believable. The world needs to be believable. So more recently, I've been playing a game called Ark Raiders, and the sort of construction of that world is really interesting to me because it kind of it inspires me to think about new types of aesthetics. And interestingly enough, the way that they construct the sort of levels in Arc Raiders is very much driven by this tool called Houdini, which is kind of a procedural content generation tool that I'm not only used to sort of using, but I was thinking of that as a sort of foundational element to the game. So what you'll see in the sort of final product is very much a sort of mashup of these sort of brutalist themes, right? Large scale structures, but more small scale detail. But it will be very dystopian, right? It's going to be a bleak world. It's going to be quite a dark setting in which to live. And the idea is for the game is that you actually live in this believable world. So what I'm really after is trying to sort of describe a world through code and through art that makes you feel like you can still survive in this relatively bleak space. And I'm relying on a huge number of art assets from these asset marketplaces, but trying to put some effort into making each one of them actually kind of useful and fitting for the theme. So the idea is that obviously you're in a sort of post-apocalyptic world, so there's still survivors out there, but they're kind of relatively few. But just before the fall of civilization, there were a number of different sort of class-based ruling class kind of systems. So I wanted to put some sort of social commentary in there as well. And ultimately what I want to do is create a game where everything feels like there's been effort and thought put into it. I really appreciate films where there's like every single thing is tied together. And I love the attention to detail for those kind of things. And I want to make a game that feels like that. So the core aspect of the game is this believability. The idea that everything should do what you think it should do. Even though we're using sort of game mechanics to play that out, it should still be fundamentally understandable. And the kind of things that you'll do, things like farming and cooking and trading and, building out your base, that's going to be a fundamental kind of underpinning, right? That you're living your life still. The difference is that for you as a player, you have a huge responsibility, and that is to protect the rest of civilization, right? So there's people who still live on the surface of the planet, but that planet has become massively toxic. And you are the custodian of this underground facility, the complex. And the idea of the complex is that it's the sort of last hope for humanity. And so we'll explore those kind of things over the next few devlogs, but this idea of I'm trying to create this underground facility with a sense of scale, right? A sense of responsibility. So you'll live in a small scale, like human area, but there'll be these vast underground vaults. And that's what I want to do really, is figure out how to make that scale work. And interestingly enough, there is a bunch of like art assets that at least prove to me that it's possible. So this company called Big, Medium and Small has some art assets available that I could purchase, but I'm more about taking inspiration from these things and creating my own where I can. So with Houdini, I can kind of, at least start to think about fleshing out some of this world. And I've started generating tools in Houdini. Houdini is a really good way of generating like procedurally generated geometry. But it doesn't do runtime stuff. It doesn't do sort of things that you could do in the game. It's kind of like a structure builder before the game starts. So fundamentally, I'm kind of mixing a number of different technologies together to try and create the world. But hopefully you're interested in seeing the world with me. There's a bunch of arse assets already in there that have been really inspirational from me, and I'll show you what those kind of things are. Fundamentally, I've been testing for the last few months a bunch of sort of Houdini approaches, really. And I think I've finally settled on the overall structure of the level. So that's another devlog that will sort of deal with things like how the world will look, how it will be laid out and that kind of thing. But here's the themes, right? Brutalism, survival, grim outside, but a more warm and friendly inside the complex. And then the sort of interesting transitions between them. Outside has civilization, but it's kind of on its last legs. Inside, the civilization's essentially on ice. It's all in cryogenic sleep. So you're there to sort of protect that. And, you don't want the two things to mix. That's a fundamental of the gameplay. So there you go. Like, I think that the interesting part here is exploring what you can do as a sort of, as this guardian, what things you want to be able to do, how you will create the sort of space underground, what structures you'll build, what facilities you want to be able to enable. And it will be essentially a blank canvas for you. I think that's one thing I really like from indie games, is that they give you a blank canvas and you can project your own thinking into that world, right? Base building games allow you to do a lot of that. So I'll build in some gameplay elements, but ultimately what I'm trying to do is make it more of a sandbox for you to experiment with. So there will be some narrative and those kind of things, but we'll see how that shapes up over time. And that's it for the first devlog. Next time we'll go through a little bit of the sort of technology side of things. Okay.